The neon lights buzzed above the dimly lit bar, but it wasn't the cold beers or the jukebox playing 90s hits that caught their attention. No, it was the heavy footsteps, boots thudding like a drumbeat that echoed across the room. The crowd stilled, the buzz of conversation dying in an instant, as two identical figures stepped into the bar, black, towering with the same steely eyes and calm demeanor. It was clear they were brothers, but what wasn't clear was just how far they were willing to go to defend themselves. One of them was dressed in a worn leather jacket, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. The other, a military cut, a buttoned-up jacket that screamed authority, the kind that sent chills through the spine of anyone who knew the weight behind it. As they walked through the door, a group of officers who had been chatting at the bar shifted, eyes narrowing. "Should have stayed in the damn military," one of them muttered under his breath, his voice thick with distaste. The other cop snorted. "You know what they say about men in uniform, right?" And just like that, the tension in the room thickened. The brothers felt it, the invisible line being drawn. They hadn't said a word, hadn't made a move. Yet their mere presence, their very being, set the stage for a confrontation that was about to erupt. They could feel the hostility in the air, thick like smog. What no one knew, not even the cops who sneered from across the room, was that these weren't just any brothers. The guy in the jacket, he wasn't just another soldier. He was captain, one of the most decorated officers in the Navy, and the one in the leather jacket, commander, a SEAL with more covert operations under his belt than most could count. Two brothers, two legends, walking into a bar, not knowing that tonight, their worlds would collide with the weight of a past they couldn't escape. The stakes? Life and death. They had no idea what was coming. But the clock was ticking, and tonight everything would change. Would they walk out of that bar unscathed, or would the system they had once sworn to serve turn on them? The bar had that worn-out dive bar vibe, the kind you find tucked in the back alleys of any mid-sized American city. The linoleum floors were sticky, the walls lined with posters of old rock bands that most people barely remembered. The smell of fried food and cheap whiskey lingered in the air like a bad memory. Yet, this was the kind of place where you could disappear. No one cared who you were, what you did, or how much money you had in your pocket. It was the kind of place where you could just exist without being judged, until tonight. Marcus and Malik Davis had been in places like this before. Too many times to count. Raised in the streets of Chicago, they had learned the rhythm of survival early on. Watch your back, never show weakness, and always keep your head down. But there was a difference now. They weren't just any two random guys in a bar. They were brothers, twin brothers, but their paths had taken them in opposite directions, one following the path of authority, the other walking a darker road shaped by years of dealing with the reality of being black in America. Marcus, the captain, had always been the disciplined one. His jaw was sharp and his posture even sharper. He'd gone to the Naval Academy on a full scholarship and had worked his ass off to get where he was. He had risen through the ranks to become one of the Navy's top officers, but every promotion came with its own set of challenges. There were always whispers behind his back. The good old boy network ain't for him. He's just here because they needed a token. He knew it wasn't true. He had worked for every damn thing he'd earned. But the weight of suspicion followed him everywhere, even within the Navy, where rank was supposed to protect you from judgment. Malik, on the other hand, had taken a different path. The commander, a SEAL, he was the kind of guy who didn't give a damn about rules. Hell, he'd been tossed out of a few places before he finally found his place in the SEALs. His skill set wasn't anything you'd find in a textbook. Malik was a product of the streets, molded by the environment around him, a quick wit, a sharp eye, and the kind of toughness that couldn't be broken. He didn't wear a uniform, but he carried the weight of his own kind of authority wherever he went. The kind that came from surviving on his own, never trusting anyone, and always being the guy to step into a fight. The brothers had been through a lot together, but the years had created a distance between them. Marcus had done everything to climb the ranks, get accepted, prove himself, while Malik had built his world from the ground up, learning not to trust anyone in power. They still loved each other, of course. Blood was thicker than anything else. But there was a tension that ran beneath the surface. Each of them had a different way of coping with the weight of their blackness in a world that didn't want them to rise. When Marcus walked into a room, there was a quiet dignity about him, an aura that demanded respect. He was used to people noticing him, the black man in a room full of white faces, and though he had long since stopped trying to convince them of his worth, the eyes still followed him wherever he went. He wasn't just an officer in the Navy, he was a black officer, and that carried a different set of expectations. He had to be better, smarter, faster. He knew it, but it still pissed him off. Malik, though? Malik was a force of nature. He didn't wait for respect. He demanded it. His eyes were always scanning, calculating the next move. He had learned the hard way that in this country, you weren't going to get anything unless you took it. But Malik was tired of fighting the system. Tired of trying to fit into spaces where people didn't want him. Tired of being told that the way he saw the world wasn't valid because he didn't play by their rules. And the racism? Oh, it was there. Always. But it wasn't just the overt stuff. No, it was the subtle crap. The kind that stung without you ever really knowing why. You could feel it in the air, but you couldn't put your finger on it. The sideways glances, the patronizing smiles, the ones that told him, "You should be thankful you're here." That night, they weren't just walking into any bar. They were walking into a fight. They could feel it in the air as soon as they stepped out of the car, their boots crunching against the gravel parking lot. It was a quiet town, one of those places where you could live your whole life without ever seeing something that made you look twice. But tonight was different. Tonight the air was thick with tension. It was like the universe had shifted just enough for something to go down. As they made their way inside, Marcus could sense the shift in the room. It was subtle at first, just the way the jukebox music seemed to die down as they stepped in, the murmur of conversation fading. But it didn't take long for the looks to start. The two officers sitting at the bar were the first to stare. It wasn't even the way they looked at the brothers. It was the way they didn't look at them, like they were trying to pretend they weren't there, but their eyes kept darting back. They didn't want to acknowledge it, but it was like something inside them snapped when they saw two black men walk into their favorite spot. One of them shifted in his seat, adjusting his uniform like he was about to make a move. Malik noticed first. He always did. His hand instinctively shifted to his side, just barely brushing the gun at his waist. He wasn't nervous, but he knew better than anyone how quickly a situation could escalate. He wasn't here to start trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. And it looked like tonight was no different. Marcus, on the other hand, stood still for a second longer, his gaze meeting the officers. The air between them crackled with a tension only a few would understand. The officer was the first to look away, but Marcus knew. He knew exactly what that look meant. The suspicion, the hesitation, the judgment. They didn't even know him, but they had already decided who he was, and that's when the first real hint of what was about to happen hit Marcus. There was something about this night. Something was off, like the world was about to drop its mask. And the weight of that suspicion, of that tension in the air, was about to hit them both harder than they realized. They didn't know it yet, but the story they were about to write would change everything. Because tonight wasn't just about a couple of brothers walking into a bar. It was about two black men in a world that wasn't built for them, in a town that didn't know who they really were. And in the end, it would be about more than just survival. It would be about whether or not the system would finally catch up with them. The bar was quiet now. The chatter had shifted from the hum of casual conversation to something thicker, like the air before a storm. Marcus and Malik stood in the doorway for a beat longer than they should have, both of them feeling the weight of the eyes that were on them. It wasn't the kind of silence you could ignore. It wasn't like the kind of quiet that came from people just chilling with their drinks. This was different. It was heavy. Marcus could feel the eyes on him, the way the officers' stares lingered just a little too long, the way the bar patrons seemed to shrink into their seats. Malik, though, he was used to it. Hell, he almost welcomed it at this point. He was a SEAL, one of the best, and his reputation spoke louder than anything his uniform could. But Marcus wasn't so sure anymore. The Navy had always been his escape, a way to prove that he was more than what people thought he was. But tonight, he wasn't sure if that uniform was going to protect him or paint a target on his back. The bartender, a middle-aged guy with a scruffy beard, looked up, giving the brothers a nod as they made their way to the bar. But that didn't stop the whispers. They were low at first, but they were there. The same whispers he'd heard back in high school when the rich kids looked at him like he didn't belong in their world. The same whispers he'd heard at the Navy Academy, where the admissions officer had looked at his application like it was some sort of joke. 2 beers, Malik said, his voice deep and calm as he slid onto a stool. He didn't even look at the bartender. The man didn't hesitate. He grabbed 2 bottles of Bud Light and set them down on the counter, but the silence hung between them like a veil. 2 beers for the boys, the officer who had been eyeing them said with a smirk, his words laced with an almost unnoticeable sneer. He wasn't trying to be loud, but his voice had that edge to it, just enough for Marcus to hear it, just enough for him to feel it settle in his chest like a stone. Marcus clenched his jaw. He could feel the blood rising to his face, but he didn't let it show. Not here, not now. He wasn't about to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him lose his temper. Keep it moving. Man, Malik said, his voice low, a warning that wasn't lost on the officer. The guy laughed, like he hadn't heard a word Malik said. I'm just saying that's what they say about you boys, right? He leaned back in his chair, throwing an arm over the backrest like he was just another guy chatting it up. You know, just here for the free beer and to cause some trouble. Malik's eyes narrowed. You talking to me? The officer didn't even flinch. I'm just saying you know how it is. No offense. Just calling it like I see it. Marcus knew this game. He had seen it too many times before. This wasn't some random drunk guy talking. This was the kind of microaggression that was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. The kind that didn't come with a fist or a shout, but with a quiet, steady drip of casual disrespect. It was always there, hidden in plain sight, waiting to get under your skin. And that's what made it worse. It wasn't the big stuff. It was the little things. The glances, the slights, the words that were just jokes to them, but were daggers in the heart for Marcus and Malik. Malik didn't back down. His fingers drummed on the bar, a sound so soft that only he could hear it, but the tension in the air made it seem like a drumbeat echoing in the whole damn place. He could feel the eyes on him, on both of them. It wasn't just the cops now. It was the whole bar. They were all watching. You know what's funny? Malik said, turning to face the officer. His voice was slow, deliberate. You don't even know who we are, but you're already making assumptions. You got it all figured out, huh? The officer smirked again, clearly not catching on. What, you think you're someone important? Malik didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip of his beer, letting the silence drag out for a moment longer. The brothers had gotten good at letting silence speak louder than words. It was a tactic Malik used often, and it worked. The officer shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable now, but the damage had been done. The rest of the bar was starting to shift too, like the ripples on a pond after a stone's been thrown in. They were all starting to take sides, and the more they looked, the more it became clear that the 2 brothers weren't just anyone. But that didn't stop the whispers from getting louder. Across the bar, a man with a wide-brimmed hat and a thick southern drawl spoke up. You 2 fellas know what happens when you get into it with the law around here, don't you? He said, his voice slow and syrupy like molasses on a hot day. Folks around here, they don't like your kind. His words were thick with the weight of an old stereotype, one that had been passed down for generations. Best you just get on out of here before things get out of hand. Malik's jaw tightened, but Marcus placed a hand on his brother's arm, squeezing gently. He wasn't going to let things get out of hand. Not tonight. We're fine, Marcus said, his voice low but steady. He turned toward the man with the southern drawl, giving him a firm look that was meant to end the conversation. We're just here to have a drink. You got a problem with that? The man's smile grew wider, but it wasn't a friendly one. I don't got a problem with you 2. I got a problem with the way you're looking at me. Malik stood up now, but Marcus quickly rose as well, his hand on his brother's shoulder. Let's go. Let's get out of here, Marcus muttered under his breath. But it was too late. The damage was already done. The officer at the bar, who had been quietly watching, stood up and adjusted his belt. You 2 gotta leave, now. Marcus felt his heart sink. It wasn't even about what was happening right now. He could deal with the bullshit. But what came next? That was the problem. He knew this could escalate so quickly. He could feel it in his gut. These weren't just any cops. These were the type of guys who had spent their whole lives learning how to crack a joke but still keep the knife sharp behind their backs. Malik stepped forward, towering over the officer by several inches. But before he could say anything, the officer stepped back, pulling out his radio, his hand twitching at the side of his holster. Marcus saw the flash of the badge and then, without a second thought, grabbed his brother's arm. Malik, don't, Marcus said. He didn't need to say more. The officer's eyes hardened. I'm going to have to ask you to leave, or things are going to get real ugly real fast. And there it was. The first true sign that things were about to go from bad to worse. The tension was thick now, the room heavy with the weight of unspoken history and old resentments that had been simmering for far too long. Marcus and Malik knew what was coming. They didn't need anyone to tell them. They could already feel the familiar sting of injustice, slow, steady, and suffocating. The question wasn't if it would escalate, it was when. And as the officer's fingers hovered dangerously close to his holster, Marcus knew the clock was ticking. The tension in the bar was thick now, like the air before a thunderstorm. People were shifting in their seats. The murmurs had turned into low whispers. Every eye was trained on Marcus and Malik, like they were the latest spectacle in a place that usually ran on small-town monotony. The officer's hand hovered dangerously close to his gun, and the bartender, the guy who had been polite just moments ago, now had his eyes on the scene calculating, like a chess player watching his opponents make their moves. Marcus could feel his heart racing. He hated the way things were escalating. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He hadn't come here for a fight. Hell, he didn't even come here for this kind of attention. But there it was. The stairs. The weight of everyone's expectations. His brother Malik wasn't helping. But Marcus could understand it. Malik never backed down from a challenge. And tonight, it was looking like the town was going to get the better of him. But there was something deeper in the air. Something more insidious. Don't look at me like that. Boy, the officer growled, his voice sharp now, edged with more aggression. You got a problem? You don't belong here, do you? Marcus clenched his fists. The words hit harder than he expected. No problem, he muttered, stepping back and keeping his voice calm. We're leaving, all right? Just relax, but the officer wasn't having it. He squared his shoulders, as if he had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the boys would make a move, give him a reason. Nah, man, I don't think you understand. You're not just gonna stroll in here like you own the place. His eyes narrowed. I told you to leave. I'm about to help you out. Malik's chest heaved, his hands clenched tighter. His body was taut like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. He wasn't about to take this. His whole life had been about proving himself in spaces where people assumed he didn't belong, and tonight, he wasn't backing down. I ain't going nowhere, man, Malik growled. You got a problem with me? Step outside? The officer, still holding his ground, took a slow step forward, his boots scraping against the sticky bar floor. The sound was like a bell tolling, signaling something was about to break. But it wasn't just him. It was the other patrons, the people who'd been silent up until now. They were shifting in their seats, leaning in slightly, their whispers turning into murmurs of disapproval. No one was doing anything to stop this. Behind the officer, a man in his 40s who'd been sitting at the corner booth slid out of his chair. His thick glasses glinted under the bar's fluorescent lights, and he carried himself like a man who had been around long enough to understand how this all worked. He looked at the officer first, then turned his eyes onto Marcus and Malik. His lips pressed into a tight line before he spoke, almost too casually. I don't know why you boys are here stirring up trouble, he said, his voice slick with condescension. I saw you walk in. What did you expect, huh? This is our town. You can't just stroll in and act like you're welcome. The words sent a ripple through the room, as if someone had thrown a rock in a still pond. The quiet buzz of chatter escalated into full-blown murmurings. People were starting to take sides, and Marcus could feel the isolation creeping in. The tension wasn't just about two officers anymore. It was the whole damn room, and that was the scariest part of it all. They were standing alone. But it wasn't just the bar. It wasn't just the people. It was the system. The whole thing was rigged against them, and this bar was a microcosm of that reality. It wasn't the first time Marcus had felt the sting of an entire system pointing its finger at him. And Malik? Well, Malik was used to it, but that didn't make it any easier. That didn't make it any less painful. And now the man with the glasses was calling for backup, his hands slowly reaching for his phone. Marcus knew that this was what it came down to. This wasn't just about a couple of guys in a bar anymore. This was bigger. This was the kind of thing that had been happening for centuries. The kind of thing that built walls between people who should have had each other's backs. The kind of thing that made every move a game of survival. The officer, still standing tall, looked over his shoulder at the man in glasses. "You calling someone, Tony?" he asked, his voice too casual for the situation at hand. Tony didn't even glance back. "Yeah, I am. You're gonna need some backup, trust me." Marcus saw the phone before it even rang. This wasn't about control anymore. This was about who held the power in this town, and right now, Marcus and Malik didn't stand a chance. The bartender, seeing the brewing storm, quietly began wiping down the counter, avoiding eye contact. It wasn't lost on Marcus that he hadn't stepped in to diffuse the tension. This wasn't the first time someone had been thrown out for no damn reason, and it wouldn't be the last. Silence, complicity, the subtle way people avoid standing up for what's right, even when they know something's wrong. The next few moments were a blur of motion. The tension in the air seemed to condense into a single breath before everything shifted. And then it happened. A second officer, heavier set, older with a permanent scowl on his face, stepped into the bar, his eyes immediately locking on the brothers. The newcomer didn't waste any time. He started barking orders, his voice loud enough to cut through the noise. "What's going on here? You two need to get the hell out of here or we'll handle this the hard way." Marcus took a slow, steady breath. He was trying to keep calm, trying to keep his head in the game, but it wasn't easy. His mind was spinning. His fingers itched to move, but he wasn't sure what the right move was. He had been in enough situations to know that acting rashly wouldn't get them anywhere. But he also knew, deep down, that they weren't going to let them walk out of here peacefully. Not after the way things had escalated. Malik stood tall beside him, his face set in stone. He wasn't going to back down. He was a soldier through and through, and he wasn't going to let these men, these people, make him feel small. He wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. "Tell you what," Malik said, his voice a growl. "We'll leave, but you don't get to tell us when." The officer's hand twitched, and for a second Marcus thought he might pull his gun. The whole room held its breath. The flickering neon lights above seemed to hum louder, like a warning. People were starting to back away, but the tension was still thick in the air. Tony, still standing by his phone, looked around the room. "You boys don't get it, do you?" he asked, his voice suddenly cold. "This is how it works. You don't belong here, and you don't get to make the rules." The words hit harder than any punch. The officer by the door took a step forward, his eyes cold, calculating. "We're not going to ask you again." It was clear now. This wasn't just about a bar fight or a misunderstanding. This was the first stage in a much bigger play, a play that had been rehearsed countless times before. The stakes were rising, and Marcus knew they were running out of time. The walls were closing in, and the consequences of silence, of inaction, were about to be felt. In that moment, Marcus knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to leave this bar the same way they walked in. The turning point was coming. And everything, every choice they made in this moment, would lead to it. The bar was suffocating now, the air thick with tension that crackled like static electricity. The low hum of conversation had completely died out, replaced by a dead silence that felt as sharp as glass. Every eye in the room was on Marcus and Malik. The officers were closing in, their movements deliberate, calculated. It wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was an execution. "Last chance, boys," the older officer growled, his voice thick with menace. His hand hovered just inches from his holstered gun, but there was something in the way he stood, in the way his jaw clenched, that told Marcus this wasn't just about following orders. This was personal. Malik's fists were clenched tight at his sides, his knuckles white, but he didn't back down. His eyes were locked onto the officers, unwavering, a silent challenge hanging in the air. "You don't get to make the rules," Malik said, his voice cold but steady. The anger was there, yes, but there was something deeper, something darker, a kind of tiredness like he'd seen this show before and knew how it ended. And yet he wasn't walking away, not this time. Not ever again. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He had never been the one to escalate things. He was the calm one, the one who tried to avoid confrontation, who always looked for a way out. But here, in this moment, he knew there was no backing down. They couldn't walk away from this, not without proving something to themselves, to the world, to everyone who had ever told them they didn't belong. "You need to get out now, or we'll make you leave," the officer repeated, his voice rising now, frustration leaking into every word. He took another step forward, his boots scraping the floor with a grinding sound that made Marcus's teeth ache. The other officer, still standing by the door, had his hand on his radio. Marcus could feel the weight of the situation settling in, like the air itself had thickened and was pushing in on him from all sides. The tension was palpable, electric. It was like the room was holding its breath, waiting for someone to make the first move. And then it happened. Malik moved first. It was a blur, a flash of motion, his body a coiled spring of muscle and energy. He stepped toward the officer, his hand snapping out faster than the human eye could follow. The officer's hand went to his holster, but Malik was already there. He grabbed the officer's wrist, twisting it with such force that the man grunted in pain. For a split second, it looked like the officer might break free, but Malik's grip was unrelenting. The whole bar went silent. Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his ears. Everything was moving in slow motion. The second officer, the one by the door, saw what was happening and lunged forward, but Marcus was already on him. Without thinking, he grabbed the officer's arm, yanking him back. It was a scramble, a mess of bodies, a clash of willpower and rage and exhaustion. "Stop! Stop!" the officer yelled, his voice breaking. "Don't make this worse!" But it was too late. The tension that had been simmering for hours, for years, exploded all at once. The officer whom Malik had grabbed finally managed to break free, but Malik's fist landed square in his gut, knocking the air out of him. The officer staggered back, gasping, but Malik wasn't done. He lunged forward again, this time catching the officer off guard. A shout rang out, and suddenly the door to the bar burst open. The backup was here. Another officer, younger, taller, with a face as cold as marble, stepped in. His eyes immediately went to the chaos unfolding in front of him, and his hand instinctively went for his gun. The room seemed to hold its breath. The new officer didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His stance was enough to let everyone know what he intended. Malik's eyes locked onto the officer, and in that moment, it was like everything in the world had narrowed down to just him and that officer. The gun in his hand, the tension thick as oil. Marcus felt the fear trickle down his spine. He knew what could happen next. It wasn't a question of if the gun would be drawn. It was just a matter of when. And then, without warning, the officer raised his hand and barked, "Freeze! Everybody freeze! Don't make me shoot!" The words hit like a slap in the face. Time slowed. The room froze. Marcus could feel the sweat on the back of his neck, could feel his breath come in ragged gasps. He wasn't sure if it was the heat of the moment or the anger pumping through his veins, but something inside him snapped. "Don't do it," Marcus said, his voice a low growl. He wasn't speaking to the officer anymore. He was speaking to himself, to everything that had led to this moment. He was trying to talk himself down, trying to make sense of it all. But the anger was too thick, too real. "You don't get to take us down just because you're scared of us." The officer hesitated, just for a moment. But that moment was enough. Malik stepped back, slowly, eyes never leaving the officers, and Marcus did the same, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. They didn't trust the officer, not for a second, but they knew how easily this could turn into something they couldn't take back. The tension didn't dissipate. It hung in the air like smoke, suffocating thick. But before anyone could make a move, a voice rang out from the back of the room, piercing the heavy silence like a shot. "Enough. Everybody, enough." Tony, the man with the glasses. He stood up, his hands raised, palms out, a kind of reluctant authority settling over him. "This has gone too far," he said, his voice shaky but firm. "Y'all need to stop. We don't need to be doing this." The words hung in the air for a heartbeat longer than they should have. No one moved, not even the officers who were still poised, their hands hovering over their weapons. Tony wasn't a hero. He wasn't a savior. But he was the one who saw, in that moment, how far things had gone, and how quickly they could spiral out of control. Marcus locked eyes with Malik. It was a wordless understanding, a brief exchange of thoughts that needed no translation. This was it. This was the crossroads. They could go left, let things cool down and walk away, back into the same world that had always treated them like strangers. Or they could stand their ground, fight, make a statement. Malik's eyes flickered, just for a moment, to the officers, then back to Marcus. His jaw tightened. "We're not walking away," he said quietly, but there was a fire in his voice now, a conviction that made Marcus's heart ache with a mix of pride and fear. And then, in that instant, Marcus understood. This wasn't about fighting the officers. This wasn't about winning or losing. This was about making a stand, about showing that even in a world stacked against them, they still had the power to say no, to refuse to be cowed, to refuse to let the systems of oppression dictate their lives. "All right," Marcus said, his voice steady. "We're not walking away." The officers were still standing in the same position, unsure of what to do. For the first time, the brothers weren't afraid to be seen, to stand tall, to look these men in the eye and say, "We're not your damn problem." The room was still. For a moment, everything felt suspended in time, as though the entire world was waiting for someone to make the next move. And then the tension snapped. A single shot rang out, echoing through the bar, but it wasn't what anyone expected. The shot shattered the silence. It wasn't a bullet. It was the sound of the door crashing open. A woman mid-30s in a crisp black suit, her eyes sharp with purpose, stepped into the bar. She didn't look like anyone who'd normally walk through that door. Her presence was as commanding as the storm clouds on the horizon. "Everybody stay where you are," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "This stops now." Her words were like a bomb dropped in the middle of the bar. The officers froze, unsure of what to do. The patrons, who had been watching with bated breath, took a collective step back, confused and uncertain. The woman didn't waste a second. She stepped forward, her gaze sweeping across the scene, her eyes landing first on the officer who had drawn his gun. "Put it down," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "Now." The officer hesitated, his grip tightening around his weapon. But something in the woman's stare, something solid and unwavering, broke through. He lowered the gun. For the first time that night, the tension in the room began to loosen. Malik and Marcus stood motionless, their bodies still coiled with adrenaline. They didn't know who this woman was, but right now it didn't matter. All that mattered was that someone had stepped in. Someone had said enough. The woman didn't even look at them. She was already moving toward the officer who had been antagonizing Malik earlier, her eyes fierce. "Officer Williams, I've warned you about this behavior before," she said, her voice steady, controlled. "This is your final strike," Officer Williams stammered, caught off guard, but didn't speak. The woman continued, her words sharp and cutting through the room. "I'm the new head of internal affairs. I've been watching this whole damn town, and this isn't the first time I've seen you use your badge to harass people, is it?" The officer's face turned pale. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. The woman's presence alone was enough to silence him. She turned toward the bar's owner, who was standing in the back, still watching everything unfold. "You're complicit in this," she said, her voice low. "You let this go on, and that's not okay. Do you think your customers don't see it? Do you think you're invisible in all of this?" The man faltered, looking down at the ground, unable to meet her gaze. The weight of her words crushed him. Malik stepped forward, his posture a little less tense now. He was watching the woman with a mix of caution and curiosity. She wasn't just here to defuse a situation. She was here to dismantle the system that had allowed it to escalate. And for the first time that night, Malik felt the smallest bit of hope, flickering like a match against the wind. "I'm not going anywhere, you know," Malik said quietly, his voice steady. "I've spent my whole life fighting this crap. Ain't no way I'm backing down now." The woman looked at him, her expression softening. "You don't have to fight anymore, not like this. The system has a way of wearing you down, breaking you until you're too tired to care. But not anymore. Not today." She turned back to the officer, who was now looking like he was about to crumble under the weight of his own shame. "You're done. You'll never wear that badge again." For a moment, the bar was completely still, as if the world was holding its breath. But then, in a small, almost imperceptible shift, the tension began to dissolve. The officers backed away one by one. The woman stood in the center of the room, her posture strong and resolute, her eyes scanning the room like a protector. And just like that, the storm that had been brewing for hours seemed to pass. The woman's voice cut through the stillness one last time. "This isn't just about tonight. This is about what happens next. This town has a choice: to stay stuck in the old ways, to keep pretending things are fine, or to finally wake up and make a change." Marcus and Malik exchanged a look, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They were still standing in the same spot they had been when everything had started. But now things were different. The world hadn't changed overnight. But for the first time in a long while, There was hope that it could change. As the woman turned to leave, she paused at the door. She looked back, meeting Marcus's eyes. "You too?" she said, her voice softer now, but still carrying that weight. "This fight isn't over, but you're not alone anymore." The door closed behind her, and for a moment everything was silent. The bar felt smaller now, quieter, less oppressive. But the reality of the situation didn't fade just because the immediate tension had passed. Marcus could feel it, the long, deep exhale that came when you thought you were done, when you thought it was over. But it wasn't. The system, the biases, the microaggressions, the injustice, they didn't go away with a single moment of intervention. They would still be there, just beneath the surface, ready to rear their ugly heads again. Still, as Marcus turned to leave, Malik by his side, he couldn't help but feel the faintest shred of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. A glimmer of something that felt like it could grow if enough people started standing up, if enough people started demanding change. As they stepped out into the night, the cold air hit them like a wave. The world outside the bar was still the same. It was dark, it was cold, and it was full of people who didn't give a damn about what just happened. But it didn't matter. Not anymore. "Man, we're still here," Malik said, a grin creeping onto his face. "And we're not going anywhere," Marcus nodded. "We're still here, and that's all that matters." As they walked down the street, the weight of the night settling into their bones, Marcus couldn't shake the question that had been swirling in his mind. How many more times would it take? How many more brothers, how many more sisters would have to face the same fight before things truly changed? The question hung in the air like a cloud, and Marcus couldn't help but feel like it was one they couldn't afford to ignore. Because until change came, they would keep standing, keep fighting, keep speaking the truth. No matter how many times the system tried to break them, they would keep coming back. And somewhere, in that small moment of hope, Marcus knew this was only the beginning.